I want to welcome everybody to, I think it's our fourth Town Talks Ratepayer Member Forum. This one has a focus on infrastructure, which is most assuredly one of the more significant issues that we're facing. And so I wanted to start with introductions first of all, and then I'll briefly let people know what the format for the session is going to be for this evening. First of all, we have joining us Peter Bourdignon, one of our members of council, and Sean Carey, who's Director of Operations for the town. They will be sharing updates with us and responding to the questions we have with regard to infrastructure matters. And Brian Harkness, who's on the Ratepayers Board and heads up our committee focusing on infrastructure, will be participating with me in the questioning exercise. So I'll just very briefly confirm the format is we'll have upfront presentation and remarks from Sean and Peter, and then we'll launch into a moderated discussion. We'll focus on key issues and projects. We've got a number of questions submitted by our members. We'll be getting further questions through the chat function through the course of the session. And I'll just add that any questions unanswered due to time constraints, we'll have a follow-up to get response to those. So with that, let me kick it off by, I'll hand it over. I think, Sean, you are going to be going through a few slides as an upfront table setting for folks. Peter, you'll probably have some remarks as well. And then we'll, as I say, get into the questioning side of the equation.
Thanks, Jim. Maybe I'll go, I don't know, Councillor Bourdignon, if you had any words to say at first, or I can just kick it off. Just want to thank the members for having me tonight, and Councillor Bourdignon as well. And special thanks to Jim and Brian Harkness as well. Jim, the three of us have met several times, I think, over the last few months, or maybe it's a few times over the last several months, to talk about infrastructure. And I really value those discussions. It's been helpful to get some insight through those two gentlemen on the members and their thoughts, but also some sage advice back to me as well. So this is not the end of those discussions. This is just partway through them to bring this back to the rest of the membership. So happy to be here tonight. And I think it wasn't too long ago I was here to talk about transportation. That might have been the third town talk of the four. So that was really good. I enjoyed that. And really like the actual back and forth and the discussion that came from it. So I'm going to do my best to keep my presentation real brief. I have sometimes a hard time doing that, but I will try to get through it. I think it will quickly. And I think part of that is it might just be a good reference point to go back to based on some conversations that might come up or some questions. And also maybe just to kind of tee up the discussion a little bit. So yeah, with that, we can get right into it. Unless Councillor Bourdignon, did you have anything you wanted to?
Sure. Thanks, Sean. Just quick introductions. Most of you know who I am. Again, the BMRA, a vital function to the town and its ratepayers, putting together these town talks. I think I was at the first one, if not the second one, and back again working with Director Carey. This is and I think the reason both of us are here is because there's the project base, then there's the council side, and that's when the two have to come together. Not just on planning the future, dealing with the past, but also the fiscal responsibility of it all. And I think that's where that's where we have to go through all the reports, looking at all the projects, and that's where you start tying in planning, operations, finance, council. And council's there to represent the ratepayers. As you know, I think John Leckie always says, "There's only one wallet." So let's see what that dollar gets us at the end of the day. So. With that, I'm here to support Sean from the council side and go from there. So look forward to it.
Okay, maybe with that, Jim, maybe if we could pull up the presentation, I'll just really quickly go through that and then, okay, if we could just go to the next slide, please. So I threw this together pretty quickly, so I'll maybe go through it just as fast. But you can see here just kind of the key things I wanted to focus in on before we turn it over to questions. And so next slide, please. So just really briefly, it's kind of a messy slide, but I think it's important to note just kind of a baseline information is when we're talking about capital infrastructure, and I would suggest the operations department generally has the majority of that within our kind of responsibilities. And there's a number of things that'll come up throughout, I expect, through the discussion today and through part of my presentation is, asset management plans. Those are regulatory requirements to have them, and they're good to have, as we all know, because it sets out a plan for how we're going to keep our existing infrastructure maintained in good working order. And there's a bunch of things that feed into those, which we deal with on a regular basis. And roads needs studies, which we do every 5 years, bridge and culvert assessment every 2 years, and the CCTV, which is video work actually to look at the condition of our sewer and stormwater. And I'll speak a little bit about those later. So those really tell us what condition our assets are in, and then that helps inform where we go from there and when we need to do routine maintenance. We also have our development charges background study, and that talks about, well, what's the growth that we know is coming, and what type of infrastructure needs to be upgraded in order to meet that demand. And then there's a wastewater and wastewater servicing strategy, which has been something that, since my kind of tenure in this role, is something that we've been talking about quite a bit. And these are sanitary servicing extensions and water servicing extensions, mainly within the urban areas. So that strategy sets out 1 to 5, 5 to 10 year, 10-year plus as to when we feel would be the best to start connecting more of the urban areas and get them off of septic systems in particular. And that might come up later on as I expect. And then we also have just our general servicing strategy, infrastructure plans, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then we also talked about, as Councillor Borgman said, how do we pay for this stuff? Part of it is through development charges, and that's all related to the development charges background study. And there's a reserve that's carried for that. We also have reserves for the water, wastewater, and roads. We've got taxation, sometimes debt for significant major projects. And then the other thing is to what Councillor Borgman was saying about there's only one wallet, we often try to dip into other people's wallets. So that might be the provincial or federal government as well. So we're constantly looking for funding opportunities to help offset the cost to the ratepayers. Next slide, please. So this was actually something that I thought was as important to put on here, because one of the things that I've fully understand it is why does it take so long in some cases to get a shovel in the ground and see something visually that's been improved in the community. And I thought this was just a good illustration of some of the stuff that we need to go through to get us from kind of A to Z, Z being actual shovel in the ground and completion. So some of that is we have to, 2 to 3 years, maybe doing EAs and infrastructure plans, which is box one. Then you get into project scoping, and that's where we're looking at, okay, what do we need to do with this project? What's the scope? What's the scale? What are our communications needs based on potential impact to residents? Who do we need to collaborate? Does Grey County need to be involved because there's some cost sharing or some issues that we could deal with together? And this is where a budget starts coming together. And one of the important things to note is when we're putting forward a budget at this stage, it's very preliminary, but it's based on benchmark cost, which is something that we've talked quite a bit about with, or maybe not enough about from a staff perspective with council, because I think it's such an important part of how we budget projects. And I'll talk about some of the challenges we've had with that a little bit later. And then part of that is getting us ready for annual budget approval. And we had the pleasure of seeing Jim earlier today at Community of the Whole representing BMRA talking about budget. And that starts for us around July. And right now is critical point of getting our capital projects nailed down and hopefully with an approved budget in January, February. And once we get those approvals, then we start going forward. Then we just get, I'll cut the next slide here quickly, but just one back one, please, quickly. Yeah, thank you. RFP developments. This is a request for a proposal. This is something that, I've been in the role for almost 2 years now. This is something where I've really honed in on as to where we've made some significant improvements. And this is a part where this is really what drives accountability into our consulting engineers. It's also something where it speaks to really nailing down what it is we want out of the project in terms of tasks, deliverables, and being clear in that and what that means for budget, what that means for schedule. So this has been something that we've really taken a critical look at in terms of managing budgets and schedules when we're managing consultants at the same time. And then it just gets into the rest of the roadmap here, which is you award your contract. In some cases, we need to do preliminary design because it's a wastewater treatment plant expansion. There's a lot of components. We don't really know what we need. Then we go into final design, construction tender. One of the things that we've been looking at as of late is for construction tenders is to pre-qualify our contractors to make sure that they fully understand what our expectations are. We do site visit meetings with all the contractors or potential bidders, and then we get into so there's a full understanding of who's doing what and what the expectations are. And then initiate construction, that can take some time, commission, warranty period, and project closeouts. One of the things that we've been doing as of late is project closeouts are basically a post-mortem or a debrief. What went well with the consulting engineer? What maybe didn't go well? What went well with the contractor? What didn't go well? And we do that as an entire team so that we, lessons learned going into the next similar project. And some of it comes down to just words, specific words in contracts, because words, as we all know, words matter. So next slide. I won't get into this page, but this was just something to try to illustrate a couple of things. One is just, this is one of the capital planning tools that we use. And I've shared this earlier with Jim and Brian Harkness. This is a small demonstration of some of the capital projects that we have ongoing. There's 3 more pages of these. So we have about 100 or more capital projects that we're currently managing. The color codes there just speak to kind of scope and scale of a project. So in some cases, they're really simple. It might be a high dollar value, but it's merely going out to tender, getting some bids, and having installed. Other cases where you look at some of these where there's blue, which is, we take a year of doing an EA or a year and a half of doing an environmental assessment. Then we head in, and that's communications. Then you get the purple, which is, or green, which is preliminary design. Purple is final design, and then construction. So some of these take multiple years is what I'm trying to get across here on some complex projects to get through the regulatory process and also to carry that through a budget process as well. So part of it is similar to some projects, which I'll talk about in a minute, is you can get kind of caught in a budget cycle. And when we're talking about infrastructure, particularly infrastructure that we need in the ground sooner than later, we don't really want to get caught in a budget cycle. In fairness to the residents and fairness to council, we want to bring this forward as new projects at the appropriate time so they can make fulsome decisions. Next slide, please. So just wanted to tie in a couple, like there's a big list, but particularly I've been talking with Brian and Jim about some of, we've been kind of tracking a couple of projects and to talk about challenges and opportunities kind of collectively with some of these. These are some of the big ones we're working on. West Side Water Storage environmental assessment is a fairly large chunk. We talked about it briefly today at Committee of the Whole. It's an environmental assessment that has about a $10 million price tag on it, and it's to deal with growth, and it's also to deal with just water storage deficiencies that we have in the west side of the town. Then we have the east side water storage and supply class environmental assessment we've just recently kicked off. That is one where we're looking at both supply and storage. So, we're going to expand our existing water treatment plant to full build out in 50 years. Are we going to, do a sharing agreement with Collingwood, or are we going to build a brand new treatment plant? Others is at Thornbury Wastewater Treatment Plant being both the headworks and the expansion. 2 significant projects. Headworks was a really challenging project on a whole number of fronts, and a lot of lessons learned around budget, scheduling, timeline, having adequate resources to manage these, and expansion is where we're heading into. Another one is Thornbury West Reconstruction Phase 1. This is a big project which keeps getting bigger, and this is looking at full gamut of the west part of Thornbury, really, and reconstructing those and looking at active transportation and connectivity and redoing leaky pipes, substandard water main, correcting services, etc. The other one, more Craigleith focused, is the next couple of ones, is Gray Road 19 and 21. There's a lot of road related projects happening. That's a county project, but does have impacts on our infrastructure. We're looking at doing a reconstruction of Jozo's as well, and looking at how we look at, again, connectivity, working with our partners like Blue Mountain Village Association, et cetera, on their kind of needs with that type of reconstruction. We also have a number of Craigley sanitary servicing extension projects currently underway at Price's Development, at Tyrolean Village area. And then at Drake's Path as well. And then there's another one in there we just completed, which was a water-related project in Tyrolean area as well. Another one that I won't get into a lot of detail on, but one of our big needs right now is we're a growing community, is the machinery and the equipment that we need to continue to either maintain or replace as assets, and ensuring that we're able to continue to build out some of that equipment as the community grows. So we're looking at Ravenna, our roads department and depot in Ravenna, and looking at expansion opportunities there. And then there's the Arthur Street parking lot. This is one of those projects that is super important, and who would have known that a parking lot could be complex, but it's been an interesting project, and I won't get into much more than that, but there's a good opportunity for revenue through that, through paid parking as well. So next slide, please. I won't touch on this. I expect too much, but I expect there'll be some comments. This is water and wastewater needs. This is a common theme that's occurring. Obviously, you've probably been aware of what's happening with our neighbors to the east in Collingwood around some of their water-related issues. The challenge here with a lot of municipalities in this area is aligning the pace of growth with our existing infrastructure. COVID and shifting patterns, as well as this anecdotal shift of seasonal versus full-time residents, remote workplace opportunities. One of the things too is just building capacity, whether it's at our pumping stations or treatment facilities, but also looking at collaborating with our municipal partners. So talking with Collingwood, for example, about what our long-term needs are going to be for water. And then inflow and infiltration reduction strategy is another item we're looking at, is just keeping up with our existing infrastructure, ensuring that we're not prematurely expanding our treatment facilities because of leaky pipes. Next phase. So I didn't break this out into challenges and opportunity. I'm usually a bit of an optimist, maybe to a fault. So sometimes the challenge can be an opportunity. So as I said, aligning pace of growth with existing infrastructure is either a challenge or an opportunity. Asset management plan is going to be a big thing that's facing us. We have about $42 million to keep our assets in good condition over the next 5 years. Climate change or growth related needs, we got a $30 million just in the next 5 years in terms of growth related capital projects. Climate change obviously is something that has, it's not new, but we're certainly seeing more impacts related to that on infrastructure and building resilient community. So we have a number of things we're doing to tackle that, is both of our community sustainability plan, which I hope all of you are aware of because we're going through that process right now. Our drainage master plan, which is ongoing as well. And we're currently updating our engineering standards to look at what's the appropriate sizing of infrastructure to make sure we're resilient and building a resilient infrastructure for climate change needs. And then maybe some challenges, I would say, are escalating construction and material costs. We're probably all aware of these. One of the things we've really been facing is supply of qualified contractors that bid on jobs. That's been a challenge. There's lots of projects out there, and there's a labor shortage as well. Supply chain issues has really caused us a lot of problems, particularly in the Headworks construction project, and just getting accurate benchmark costs to estimate our budgets, because one of the challenges we have is our benchmark costs are what we've done in the past, and those are, in some cases we're into 120% markup on cost. The other thing is just enhanced project communications. We've invested a lot in communications and making sure that our residents are aware of both what we're doing and why we're doing it. Next slide, please. And this will be my last slide, and I'll just quickly go over this one, but I wanted to put a plug in for our corporate strategic plan. And sometimes you can kind of throw those things out there and it's big motherhood statements, but I think in this case, this is one that we've really taken to heart in our department, which is shift from a plan to plan and more of a plan to execute philosophy. It's making sure that we have projects that are shovel ready so that we can capitalize on funding opportunities to, again, reduce the draw on our own financial inputs, and aligning outcomes and timelines of our various strategies that are happening. So all of the big plans that we're doing right now around infrastructure, they're all have similar setup for targets. So tell us what our priorities should be 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10, funding sources, et cetera. So they're all aligned in terms of the outcomes we're looking for, so that we can use that and quickly transition it into actual capital plans. And the other thing it just talked about quite a bit is holding our engineering and design consultants accountable. So trying to drive that accountability into our RFP process. Council has made some investments a couple of years ago into additional resources to help us manage those projects and consultants. So we don't have consultants managing consultants. And then just utilizing existing technology for capital planning process. And I'll leave it there for now. I've talked more than I wanted to. I apologize. So I'll turn it back to you, Jim.
Okay, Peter, before we get into the question part of the exercise, did you want to make any remarks with regard to what Sean has shared, or other things you wanted to put on the table?
Well, sure. Sean covered a lot, both fiscally as well as forward thinking. One thing we need to be able to do, and this is the first lens I look at it, is it right for the community, and then how we're going to pay for it. So we have to look at those two instances. So when we open up an EA, or we open up an engineering, and my key thing, and I think it was in the very first or second chart that Sean had up there, is after we go from tender process, we go from preliminary engineering to secondary engineering. That's where I really take a look at it as well, because that's where you can get into the nuts and bolts of what's changed. Is this really an $8 million project, or is it going to be a $12 million project based on at the 30% level, at the 60% level? It was surprising to me at how much things could change in that middle line there. So that's something that I think we need to be cognizant of as we move forward. And just, before, I don't want to take up a lot of time, but what we need to do is we need to take a look at what we get from our investments, both in time. We're talking about water storage. When we look at a capital asset management program, does that buy us another 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? What does that get us when we invest today, number one? And then also on the other side of the benefit coin is, how does that help us expand? Will that give us an additional capacity for 200, for 2,000? So those are the questions we really need to ask now. And I think we've been doing a good job with that. And I think Sean and his department's been working with the engineers. It's not just a matter of I don't think of saying, okay, this is project A, it's going to cost this much, and this is what we should do. We need to know the reasons why and then behind that. And those are the thought-provoking questions that are taking those engineering at different levels, percentage of times, those meetings. That's what's factoring into a lot of the things that we do on a move forward basis. So I think from a council point of view, that's what we really want to take a look at, is what is the benefit? There's always the cost side, but what are the benefits? And if it's a matter of saying, if we do this to the water tower, will we get we won't have to worry about this for 6 councils from now, or 2 councils from now. And then also, what if we expand as we are, how will that benefit? Or are we going to be in the same boat 3.5 years from now? So those are the main questions that we're asking right now, and that's what I see coming from the council side of the table, especially in all these. Sean mentioned it's 100, I think almost 115, 116 different projects right now. Those, we're talking tens of millions, but hundreds of millions of dollars as we move forward.
It's good to hear you're referencing a long-term focus. It's hard to know past councils. They we're functioning in a different growth reality than what we have now, but you certainly get the sense that there wasn't as much of a long-term mindset and lens that was used in terms of anticipating what the infrastructure requirements were going to look like. And we certainly see that, when we observe Collingwood and, the challenges they're facing, a moratorium on approving any new projects. It kind of brings to me, the basic question, and Sean kind of alluded to this at a high level. How do you align the work of the planning department and what they're approving and how they're projecting sort of future build out with the infrastructure side of the equation to ensure that we're not getting ahead of what the infrastructure can support, as seems to have happened in Collingwood?
Jim, great question. I'll jump in before Sean is. Most definitely, and that's something that we've been doing, and I think Sean Everett's been working with SMT, or senior management team, on that, where it's not silos are gone, and I think Brian used the word silos many years ago. You can't operate like that, both fiscally as well as operationally, as well as forward thinking. We look at three aspects. And I can't speak for previous councils, but I mean, there is legacy files we have to deal with. That's not an if or maybe, that's a reality. And that's something, between the planning desk and the operations desk, the legacy files are huge. What we're dealing with today are decisions that were made, if not 1-2 mayors ago. And then what we have to look at is today, how does this affect the people that live here right now? And then how is this going to work in the future? Collingwood's a great example. Jim, if that didn't make all of us sit up in our seats very quickly and very sharply, then there was something, then you didn't have a pulse, because that was just something that was cold water in the face. And taking a look at, wow, that can happen, and that can happen here. This is not a remote town, on the fringes of the north. This is right here. This is our neighbors right next door. So then we have to start taking a look at the decisions that we're going to make now. How's that going to affect the town and who's ever sitting in our seats? You have 7 people right now. I guarantee you that might not be the same next year, or in 2026, or in 2030, or 2034. So we have to look at planning and operations together, above ground, in ground, as well as the growth, because otherwise you're going to run into a problem. It's like you're building a car and there's not an engine, or you build a car but there's not gas. So you have to be able to look at all those things as we move forward. And Sean and his team is working with planning. I don't want to speak for him, but I know Sean and Nathan work closely together now, aligning those departments. I think that's part of the reason why the restructuring, when Sean Everett became CAO, to restructure it the way that he did, to work cohabitively as opposed to in silos, because the word silo will kill you. It absolutely will. And that's I think that's one thing. And don't get me wrong, municipal government, the minutia of municipal government moves at the speed of mud. So to turn that ship when you're stuck in the mud, but I'm seeing that seismic shift. I'm starting, this is year 3. I'm starting to see how that's turning that way. And I feel positive for the future that we can start making some decisions intelligent. I don't want to look back wherever I am 10 years from now and say, oh my God, I did that, or I was a contributor to that. So I think everybody's aware of it, and everybody's got their foot on the pedal trying to move this forward. I really do, Jim.
And I guess if mentioning Collingwood, we know that we've got some water sharing agreements with Collingwood at the east end of town of Blue Mountains. I've heard some discussion of, I guess Collingwood is reviewing their agreements. What may be the impact on our town, and what's the time frame, do you think, when we actually may start to get some clarity from Collingwood in that regard?
Yeah, so I meet monthly with my kind of counterpart in Collingwood and staff to look at where they're at, because it's really coming down. We have a legally binding agreement to get a certain amount of water, and I think initially it was kind of jaw dropping as we've been saying about what happened in Collingwood, or what's been happening, and what impact that would have on us. And I think initially it was a bit of a shock based on the ask, but they've done a bunch of work or looking at different treatment options to get them out of their bind, so to speak. So they're investing some interim UV treatment and other things to deal with some of their winter treatment deficiencies. So that has really lessened, in my opinion, the need for this additional ask from us. Now, having said that, I think part of this plan to execute philosophy is that we already have our EAs ongoing for what we need to do longer term. And part of that, this has been a good dialogue and taking a challenge and making it an opportunity is, okay, if you guys are going through this process, what can we get from an expanded treatment plant now that you're doing it for our long-term needs as a community, as an opportunity, right? And we're just, because we have our EA going on, we can build that in. What we're also doing is looking at modeling, because we're in that EA process, we're modeling our growth over the next 5 years, just to see where we land as it relates to our water sharing agreement. So it's a good opportunity to look at what capacity exists, what our estimated growth patterns are. Very, guesstimates. Again, looking at when working with planning really closely on this is when are certain units coming on, do you think, with certain development, certain phases of development, and what's the total number of units, and how does that equate to us having the ability to not have this agreement with Collingwood as an option, or maybe scenario A or scenario B. So I think we're in a really good shape. And to answer your initial question about working with planning, Nathan and I are buddies. So we meet on a daily basis. And when I came to the town, it was a two-way interview for me. I wanted to make sure that I could work closely with the senior management team as they could with me. And I think it's proven itself in our ability to break down silos and work on that. We do work with our staff. We meet monthly to look at how many exact units have connected over the month. What does that mean for flows at all of our treatment facilities, both water and wastewater? What are our flows saying? What are the messages that are coming out of that? So shortly, we'll be putting up report cards on we have a dedicated water and wastewater capacity website on our project page on our website, and we'll be posting those report cards about where we stand on water and wastewater capacity monthly.
When you talk about projecting future demand on infrastructure, the wild card over the last year anyway has been the GTA exodus and the impact it's had in terms of a lot of temporary or seasonal residents becoming full-time residents. How are you trying to get your heads and hands around that consideration? Because one of the questions that was asked by one of our members was, among other issues, school system capacity is becoming an issue, which is probably something that wouldn't have been anticipated a year or 2 years ago. But with the exodus, all of a sudden, school capacity is a bit of a concern.
Jim, absolutely. We started seeing that, about a year and a half ago, and then, our great community school is starting. You get to capacity really quickly, and you're seeing a lot of people do that. I've always said I don't like the word part-time. We have full-time, we have seasonal residents, and sometimes that seasonal is, 10 months a year, sometimes it's 10 days a year. But what we saw during COVID, and I sit on the Community Recovery Task Force, is I always call it 50-50. We're probably around 75, 78% full-time, the people that were working from home, the people that were, and I remember going back to, and I'll go back to, Councillor Gamble, Bob Gamble used to tell you, he could tell you over Christmas how many visitors we had, because he'd know how many extra toilets, he'd say this many toilets were flushed, or whatever the case may be, because he'd know those numbers off the top of his head. So when we start looking at things like, can the capacity take that? If we automatically go from, if those become permanent, and we look at going from 50%, we'll call it 7,500 to 10,000, and that stays. Can we accommodate that? And then that trickles into all aspects: traffic lights, parking, school systems. So that's one thing that we did get in front of, trying to work with the school board, see what their needs would be. Even something simple like Sean was talking about, the Arthur Street parking lot. These are things that increase dramatically, like that. The food land in town is the number one food land in the chain weekly. It's not the biggest store. I have friends at Sobeys. That's there. He's in the top 3 consistently. That's not even during shoulder seasons. So that shows you how many people are here, every day right now, and that puts a strain on a lot of things. We always had to ramp up from 7,500 to 15,000, say on a long weekend, throw another 10, 12,000 at the resort, and we go from 7,500 to 28,000 very quickly. But when that's on a permanent basis or a quasi-permanent basis, as we've seen during COVID, since we'll call it March of 2020, those are challenges that puts a lot of strain on what's in the ground right now. And I think Sean's team has done a good job in addressing that.
I think you're muted, Jim.
Thank you for that. one of the comments that I received from one of our members, I thought I'd read it just because it's not a question per se, but it kind of expresses a perspective, and I'd be interested in getting your response to it. So it's for many years now in the town of Blue Mountains, we've seen constant residential development with limited development of the infrastructure that residents see and use and helps to maintain our quality of life. Things like public rec facilities, beach access, parks, tree canopy, public trails and walkways, bike lanes, etc. The residents can't be expected to support a growth agenda if it compromises our quality of life. I think that does kind of capture some of the mindset, the mindsets that residents have, which is growth probably seems, to talk to Sean's perspective, maybe more of a threat than an opportunity. And so, how do you, I guess, respond to that kind of a perspective and mindset?
I'll go first, John. They're right. This is, the simple answer is, forget me being on council, as a person, I see that. It's impossible to that crush to accommodate everybody. That's why we've been moving very quickly, looking at things like getting these in place right now. And you have a 4-year period in which a current council can do something. So we do things, and I hate to use the word plan because plans and strategies sometimes end up on a shelf, and that drives me insane. So what we have to do is these have to be living documents with actual measurable results and goalposts. So we did the leisure activities plan. We that started in September, and we had our plan done by March. So that would identify a lot of public input. We were meeting daily, weekly on that, putting that together. So something like the leisure activity plan addresses things like beachfront access. We classified all the waterfronts. We looked at anywhere from the Beaver River, in Slabtown beside me, to Delphi Park, to Northwinds. If you're a class A, that means you have washroom facilities, parking, and beach. If you're a 1B, you have everything but washrooms. So could we move that to a class B? Could we look at making areas residents only beaches? We introduced the residential parking pass when we did the paid parking, so the residents wouldn't have to pay for parking. Part of the study we're looking at is we're doing a recreational study. We've acquired some land as a town, which is in hindsight is we look smart because everything we bought is appreciated just because of the nature of the land appreciation in the town. But will that be for future rec facilities? Absolutely. Building 2 new pickleball courts, and we move those. Those are supposed to be built. That's where public input comes in. Those are supposed to be built in one area by the tennis courts. We moved over to Tomahawk because the residents said that. Got them up and built, and people are using them. So that's the kind of things that we're trying to move on quickly. Again, when people hear quick in municipal government, they kind of shake their heads. But surprisingly, things are getting done and moving down that chain. So to answer the person's comment or question, I echo their frustration. When I can't drive up my road because there's people rafting from Heathcote all the way down in the summer of 2020, and it's on the Red Bull's top 10 places to raft in North America, that just draws more attention to it. But we can't just close our eyes, put our head in the sand. We have to find solutions for that, and that's by giving people different opportunities, different areas. Putting parking lots up by Laurie Forest. We're trying to do that to help alleviate some pressures on the parking up there and the roads. We're trying to introduce winter trails where we did that last year, just to try to help everybody here being able to do more recreational things, because COVID intensifies that. Where you not only have this influx, you have the limited amount of services. So that's the most frustrating thing that people could possibly have. Say, well, it's a great warm summer, and your pier's closed, and you have these extra people. So things have just piled and piled and piled. But something like the pier, yeah, it took longer. We found, as it's like anything that's coming up to 90 years old. As you open it, you found problems, but we got it fixed. We got it open. Granted, late in the season, but it's going to be there for people to use. So we won't have to close it in 3 years from now. So those are the type of things we're doing. But like I said, the leisure activities plan to me I'm very proud of that document, and that's something with measurable results that we're going to put forth and look for solutions, especially in recreation and things like that for our residents.
Thank you. That provides a kind of a decent segue to talk about environmental factors, but there was one other question that came in just talking about growth and managing growth that I'll pass along. And it's talking about whether we could consider slowing growth or limiting growth to maintain quality of life that's special to the town of Blue Mountains. Can towns not reach capacity? And it's the idea of towns reaching capacity is an interesting one, and I recognize that it's a complicated scenario. But knowing that there are growth mandates that kind of come down from the province through the county that we have to respond to, I was interested in reading that a Collingwood resident asked the question of Simcoe. There may be certain growth mandates that are directed to municipalities, but how much flexibility is there in terms of defining the time frame in which that kind of growth can be accommodated?
Sean, you want?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question, and it's probably more of a planning question out of my hands. But I think so. A couple of things. One is, servicing can be, and availability of servicing can be a way to limit growth. And I know that different municipalities, based on whether it's inability to finance it or not, just not a desire to move it forward as a priority, you can limit growth through servicing and servicing allocation policies. That's one thing. But I think where I wanted to take it was really around, so two big things that are ongoing. One is the official plan review that's happening right now, which is really the defining document of how to plan a community. And then the other, I think, which works hand in hand with that, is the community sustainability plan, because that's where we need to look at, from my lens on that project, is how do we build a resilient community? And I think that speaks to growth. It speaks to rate of growth. It speaks to what type of growth we want and the type of infrastructure we want, whether it's, resilient infrastructure to climate change to green infrastructure, et cetera. So I don't know, Councillor Borna, if you had anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, one thing, it is a planning question, but I have people ask me this every day, and I question it myself. Well, why are you guys going to let that go through? And again, I'm not trying to take any responsibility from where we're sitting today. These are things that were in the works and approved before. So what we have to do is now we have to make sure, as we plan strategically, not just the infrastructure, but what's right, what's enough. We had this conversation, and I use this terminology, it's something very, I'll simplify it with short-term accommodations, and say, well, this is grandfather. Well, when's enough is enough? Like, when is 7 on one street too many, even if you have the separation distance that's in the bylaw? So you have to take a look at future growth. And then one thing that planning, I know, has been doing, and they're doing it. They did one last year. They're doing another one this year with another developer, is saying, before you go down a road, literally and metaphorically, engage the public. So, we have developers saying, have an open house, not sanctioned by the town, not a planning mandate saying this is happening. Because then what happens is a bulldozer will start to roll down the road, or the planning say, well, this is allowed under the Planning Act or under our growth management. But is it right? So we're asking the developers now, and there's another one coming up next week, I believe, with another developer from a legacy file from 20 years ago, where they're going to be engaging the public to say, hey, well, we're thinking about, real estate market's good now. We're thinking about redoing the phase 2 or 3. And they have the right to do that because they, when they were already at design, so they're already approval stages for planning. So what we're telling them to do is, hey, like we did it with Aquaville, I know those lands, that's been going on forever and ever under different names. Why don't you talk to the public? Rent out a place in Craigleith and have a meeting with the public. Let them know what you want to do, and then because otherwise they'll go so far down a road. The only recourse is legal, and everything will say, oh, we're going to end up at LPAT because we don't they say, well, we're within our rights to do this, and you don't want us to do this, so we have to give reasons why. So those are things we're encouraging developers to do now for future development. And that's something that I'm starting to see a little bit of positive feedback from the public saying, oh, that's great of the town to put it on. So we didn't put it on, we just suggested it to the developer. And I've seen 2 or 3 happening. And like I said, it's gonna be another one next week. So I'm encouraged by that, Jim. So hopefully that helps our planning process as we move forward. And especially as Director Carey said, is the OP review is paramount to this whole future growth of how we as a town are going to look. That the official plan is really a guiding document, because that's what you refer to as you move forward.
Yeah. To your point about the OP review, I think that will be a focus of a future session, because as it starts to gain momentum, I think letting people know the kinds of decisions that we need to be making that impact the future of the community really need to be put on the table on that. So as I say, I think that clearly environmental considerations were a big part of what we heard from our members in terms of their questions and concerns. So I'll deal with a couple of separate ones. The first one, when we talk about Thornbury West and stormwater management, and the point being made is, we've seen some significant issues already in terms of stormwater concerns. We know that there's a drainage master plan that is underway, but the question that one of our members had is, what's town council operations actively doing now to ensure developments recommended by planning don't place the town and therefore their taxpayers at risk of known deficiencies in their stormwater infrastructure?
So, yeah, I mean, as we spoke about earlier, between the two departments, we regularly meet to discuss development proposals and how that relates to our engineering standards, how it relates to our ability to operate that infrastructure into the future, right? So we're continuing to work together on ensuring that whatever might be coming from a proposed development, that from a stormwater and drainage perspective, we're able to manage it for the long term. Because as soon as it comes off that development and it's assumed, it's ours. So it needs to be done properly. It needs to be right. And I think we're all, from a staff perspective, on the same page there. Given some of those developments, I mean, there are a whole pile of different checklists that they have to go through, whether it's the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, Grace Auble Conservation, or Nottawasaga Valley Conservation to get to a place where, from a stormwater quality and control, quality and control standpoint, that we're happy with it. I think from an operations standpoint, what we've been doing, particularly in Thornbury West, and council's been supportive of this, is investing in that Thornbury West reconstruction and phase 1. And then phase 2 is we're starting to plan for the existing 5-year capital plan, to start looking at because that's an asset management need. And part of that is to look at, through all of those projects, is redoing all of the stormwater work. So it's a lot of underground stuff that happens with a lot of from an environmental impact. And I fully understand there's a number of conversations with residents and resident groups about the impact that can have on a character of an older community in that sense, in Thornbury West. So a lot of underground work with some above ground visual impact. So trying to balance all of that is something that we're trying to do from a communications perspective, and have meaningful engagement on that. But from stormwater, significant investment from an asset management standpoint to not only just look at stormwater, but when we have the whole road apart, now is the time to fix all of the aging infrastructure in there. And again, this is part of that plan to execute philosophy that I touched on really early, is we're using and it's not new technology, but we're now using it, is from an asset management standpoint, is to layer on all the stuff visually that we know we have under the ground. And the worst case scenario that I never want to be in, and we won't be in, is to replace a water main and then 2 years go back and replace the sanitary line. That, we can never get in that position. So that is about where we can combine projects and make, because there's savings to be had in making, it sounds weird, but to make a project large, there's a lot of savings around mobilizing contractors, demobilizing contractors, economies of scale. So that's a long way of answering that question, Jim. But from a stormwater perspective, big investment in Thornbury West to clean up what we know are some issues there, particularly trying to get stormwater off of private land into public land where we can control and maintain it.
And another, I guess, environmental related occurrence, which we saw fairly recently, the Craigleith wastewater pumping station backup. And the question that a member posed, what measures are being taken by the town's operations department to guarantee there'll be no sewage backing up into ratepayer homes in the near foreseeable future from the site? And what acceleration of reaction will be taken by the town to prevent such a preventable disaster in the future? So maybe you could speak to the occurrence and kind of, how the town is responding to that.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I mean, that was a significant weather event that we had. That was September 22nd, 23rd, or 23rd, 24th. If you recall that event, it was a rainfall warning from Environment Canada, and so we knew that coming in. We'd worked with Grey Sauble Conservation Authority, who provides us with some pretty detailed data. One of the number of things that our staff did was to get those treatment facilities, both in Thornbury and in Craigleith, drawn down as much as possible to get extra capacity in those facilities. So we removed biosolids. We tried to move some of the lagoons into other lagoons that had more reserves, so we could use those as areas for putting excess wastewater into. So staff were prepared for something that they knew was a long duration event. And what ended up happening at Craigleith, so we're still looking into all of the aftermath of what happened and some of the sources of what may have occurred there, but it was an exceptional amount of flow that we received into the sanitary system in that collection area. And it was the 100-year storm, according to Grey Sauble Conservation Authority. So we had staff out there all day and all night. I know our manager of water and wastewater was knocking on doors and on certain residents to make sure that either was something happening, were they aware. We had indications and not indications. We actually had phone calls from some residents. We have an after hours call line, so we called in extra staff, and she went door to door to talk to them to see what was happening. Fully can understand and appreciate what the residents had to go through there and are still going through. So we're working to look at a couple of things. Is trying to locate a source for that type of event can be kind of challenging after the fact, but we have some ideas about where we may have some serious infiltration and infiltration issues. So that's not to suggest it's all on the private side. Like aging infrastructure, sometimes you get significant duration rain and flooding occurring in areas where it can infiltrate our sanitary system. So we've done some remedial measures in some of the collection areas. When we get into, coming into this previous weekend, when we knew we were into some rain events, we had extra staff on call just in case, both to deal with any issues that might come up, but also to look at observing within the collection system as to where we might have some issues. So the other thing we do have is we have a third party that we bring in, Region of Huronia they're called, and they will just pump out of we have a wet well at the Craigleith station, and we're pumping that out and delivering it to our two other treatment facilities. So that's in a kind of a nutshell, that's what happened that event. And we just got so much flow coming in through the force main and that sanitary force main into that pumping station that it literally was blowing the pumps in the pumping station. So that's when we had brought in, all hands on deck to try to get it back up and running, and to try to figure out what to do with all this excess wastewater, which we started trucking and pumping throughout the night.
Jim, I think if I just jump in, I think that people need to know that like we're prepared for the rain as best we could. We had crews on to standby. Like I said, people worked through the night. I was out in my truck. I was following Sean around Everett. We're driving through Craigleith at 10:30, 11:30 at night. But the flow was just again, I'm not a detective. It was just even more than the rain. There was a huge influx of flow, and we have to find the source of that, because that it was literally blowing the pumps, and so by having Huroni on site and pumping it out, we did everything we could, I think, to mitigate as best we could. It was unbelievable, some of the water I saw that night over and above the rain.
Yeah. So I guess the last couple of things on some of our wastewater theme. We also had a note in from one of our members talking about a similar occurrence, I guess, on Fraser Crescent and the Lakeshore East Pump House. That's an unrelated but similar event?
Yeah, so Jim, yeah, there was some flooding and sewer backups that occurred at Fraser Crescent, relating from that event that night in September.
It was just the same event in a different location. Yeah. In fairly similar scenario, I'm taking in terms of significant flow, and not all you believe related to simply the storm volume, or?
So yeah, so the Fraser Crescent impacts were in around the Craigleith station that we were just talking about. The Lakeshore pumping station, yeah, it's the same location. It's Lakeshore, Craigleith. It's on Lakeshore is where the Craigleith main lift station is.
Okay.
So it's the same thing.
It's the same, yeah, it's the same, Jim. Sorry, the same part of the same problem.
Okay. And hopefully being addressed by the same types of actions that you're taking related to the other.
Yeah, and so the other thing, maybe if I could add to that, Jim, too, is we do have a pretty large capital project for looking at, we already had it in the books for upgrading the Craigleith station, but given the events that occurred, looking at a broader scope of that project, just to make sure that we have the proper safeguards in to deal with climate change and all the other things we've talked about.
Okay. Before I turn the questioning over to Brian to focus on some of the funding questions, which is another very significant challenge with regard to infrastructure, I thought, Sean, you mentioned green infrastructure as one of the elements, which I guess is part of how we go about planning future infrastructure. I wonder if you could just spend a minute or two talking about, when you say green infrastructure, what are you referring to? What the aspects of green infrastructure would include?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that recently presented in talking about the Arthur Street parking lot and the creation of that facility is using it as an opportunity to look at what are the various it's an easier one to think of when you think about green. It's how do you deal with stormwater? So using that as a common theme is instead of having your typical stormwater management, is there a way that we can utilize the on-site features for what's called low impact design? And it's a way where you can use the existing soils to use as an infiltration basin to look at a different way of dealing with stormwater. That is something that we've looked at as a municipality across a number of different aspects, both through development and for our own capital projects around how to manage stormwater. It has pros and cons. I wouldn't say it's new technology, but the operating and maintenance costs associated with on a larger scale are kind of unknown. So we're still exploring that. It's something that we're looking at through engineering standards around, do we want to have these type of infrastructure in certain locations and in certain design? We're not quite there yet. But for something that's more smaller scale that can be controllable, because I think when you're looking at green infrastructure, it also has to be sustainable infrastructure. And I think part of that is it resilient. That's what I always fall back to when I think about sustainability, because I think if we're going to continue to have to maintain it over the years, more so than we would anything else, is it truly sustainable? So those are kind of those philosophical questions, but it comes into what we were what Councillor Bordian said about if we're making these investments in infrastructure, what's the life cycle cost associated with that investment? So that's, how much life we're going to get out of it. What are the operating and maintenance costs associated with it? Isn't it scalable into the future to deal with more growth or more capacity needs, depending on what you're talking about? So that's one. Stormwater is a focus for LID. When we're looking at, above ground, solar lights is that common, easy example. We made a big investment in LID in all of our street lights from an infrastructure standpoint. And we're starting to see the return on investment for that, as you could expect with energy consumption. So the other one that we're looking at for part of our inflow and infiltration reduction strategy is instead of tearing open a road and replacing all of it, is looking at different technologies around lining. So that's it. You could be conceived as being green because it's a different way of getting at it and reusing old material to line existing pipes, which is cheaper and less impact overall. So, I think if you're looking at it from greenhouse gas perspective, it depends how you look at it. So if you don't have to tear open, you don't have excess soils you have to manage, you have all these things. If you can actually get in and line a pipe without having to excavate it, there's a lot of green advantages to doing that. And so we've been pilot testing that this year, actually, with lining pipes, particularly at water main breaks. And it's been proven very successful and really cost efficient.
Great. Thank you. And you referenced ROI in that response. And as I mentioned, I was going to hand it over to Brian. I think the whole question of funding is yet another huge ball of wax in terms of the amount that we're going to need to invest over the next number of years. So, Brian, did you want to lead a bit of the questioning as it relates to funding models and where it's all going to come from, et cetera?
Thanks, Jim. Hi, guys and members. Our municipality to the south of us, Grey Municipality, Grey Highlands, they in the spring were discussing a 50% increase to their user charges for, I believe it was water, but it could have been water and wastewater. I don't think we're going to see that, but I need to ask the question so you guys can assure all of us with all this planning and infrastructure programs that you've got planned that we're not all of a sudden going to have a large increase in our user charges. So that's part one. Part two is you have 100 and some odd capital projects. And I remember back to the last election cycle that Peter went through, many of the people who were running for council, there was a statement that our infrastructure projects were falling behind, so much so that our depreciation was greater than our capital projects. It seems that you have a handle on this by having 100 and some odd, but the question for all of us is, have we really got an ability to finance all of this on top of this growth that you're scheduling with our planning department? So we're not sure about that part. And then the last part, which we all don't control, but is going to affect us, as our assessment growth grows, as Jim was mentioning earlier, we're going to pay, as the municipality of the town of Blue Mountains are going to pay Grey County a larger portion of the dollar of tax assessment that hits this town. So more is going to go to Grey County and less is going to be left in the town for the council and for you, Mr. Carey, to be able to use to fund these infrastructure projects. So have at it and give us an assurance that you both have got a good handle on where we're going to go with our finances and that we can afford it. I realize maybe taxes have to go up, but certainly not in the methodology that Grey Highlands had mentioned earlier. Over to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. three very simple questions. Thanks for posing them. But all kidding aside, in the user fees, no. We're talking about that today, actually, as we're going into the new budget cycle. We've seen an increase in water this year. And there was, I was surprised. There's 5 or 6 things in Allison's report, and 2 of them are, were shocking to me about. One of them being water theft. It doesn't sound like anything, but we're seeing at a development where a contractor may hook up to a hydrant and unauthorized and use that water for their building and not pay the town for it. So we're looking at bringing in AMPS charges through our new municipal licensing bylaw to be able to combat them and hit them fiscally to be able to do that and work through that process, because everything else used to be under POA, which the Provincial Offences Act takes, we have stuff dating back 2-3 years that hasn't even gone to court yet. So there's a whole list of criteria that we're going to be working with to keep the user charges down, and through conservation, through education, through clamping down on theft, through losses. We did an inspection of 19 properties, and I believe that was it 3 or 6 of them had illegal hookups on them, and that's doesn't sound significant, but if you extrapolate that based on a percentage basis, that's a lot too. So what we have to do is first get us back to a reality where what we're using is actually what we're paying for, number one, to help not get the user charges going up. And I'll just finish off the other 2 questions you had, and then I'll turn it over to Director Carey. But in regards to funding, you have to look at different buckets. We talk about where the funding is going to come from. You have to use a mix of funding. There's water reserves, there's development charges. Our development charges, we talked about that again today. Are they good enough to keep up with the growth that we have? The asset management plan. Another thing we look at is, and it doesn't sound like a lot, is grants. As Director Carey said earlier, we have to be shovel ready to be able to get these grants. We're fortunate to be in a position where people at the council table, including myself, have connections at the provincial level where we can get ministers up here to take a walk around. During that storm on September 22nd, I was actually out with one of the Minister of Small Business and Red Tape Reduction, showing her and her team around the town that night. So and when we shine a lens on our town, there's 444 municipalities. When we shine a lens on our town or on our file and we're shovel ready, there's a lot of funding that's available at the provincial level. Getting to my next favorite topic, and the asset management plan should help quite a bit. Taxes in Grey County. This to me is just, this drives me insane from my time on the BMRA to where we are today on how much flows west and how much does not come back, and that's only going to get worse. Brian, you're right. The mayor's done a good job with working with Impact and trying to make a difference at Grey County, but each penny that goes up there becomes $1 that can't be spent here. So we have to look at ways to work with Impact. We have to work at ways to work with the county. Maybe it's, if we can maintain our own roads for $1 and they're charging us $1.50, then we should be able to maintain our own roads. So those are discussions we need to continue to have at Grey County, because otherwise all we're going to do is that pie chart's just going to continue to go like this to Grey, and that's infuriating to me. When the mayor's sitting as a county councillor and the deputy mayor, they are advocating for ourselves, but it's one of the few areas, and I think people know this by now because they've heard me say it for years. When we're at the Conservation Authority, we're one of the largest contributors, just based on our taxable residents property taxes and that. So what we do is we have a large voice there. Grey County is one of the only areas where the people who give the largest amount of money have one of the smallest voices, because it's done by population. And that's the most unfair system you could possibly see, and that has to change. Like, to the point where we're working with into the Minister of Municipal Housing, Steve Clark, that expressing our displeasure on how that funding mix works at the county level, trickling back here. You can't have a fire hose going one way and a garden hose coming the other way. It's just not fair.
Okay. Any further comments from Sean?
And maybe just a couple of quick ones. You referenced the 100+ capital projects, and I was saying earlier, some of them are a little bit more significant than others. And when we talk about scope and scale of some of those projects, it also speaks to staff resources to manage them. So one of the things when we look at, because funding isn't just delivering, just putting the project in the ground, it's that roadmap that I talked about as well, because we have to pay our staff through those projects in some cases as well, right? Through reserves, or depending on what the funding source is, or the mix of funding sources for various projects. Which in one project you could have four, maybe even 5 funding sources, particularly even external agency funding, partially funding. One of the things that we're looking at and working with our peers in planning and development engineering is, when we have a development from a growth related perspective that needs some infrastructure upgrades to accommodate that development, part of what we're looking at is there are opportunities here where we don't even have to manage the project. We're just going to oversee it, even if it is on our town infrastructure, because it helps us focus on our own assets and asset management plan delivery. It reduces the cost from a staff resourcing perspective, because we're just overseeing. We're not doing RFPs, we're not doing tenders, we're not doing the engineering, we're not doing a lot of the communication, albeit we'll require the developer to do it. So that's one that we've been actively pursuing. Because it helps alleviate pressures for us and to focus on our own infrastructure that exists today. The other thing I would say, I think daily I'm talking to Ruth and Sam from finance about, how we're doing with reserves, both road, water, and wastewater, development charges reserves as well. And often what comes up to is, well, what are our priority projects? And I would suggest that 95% of them that are on that list are ones that I would say, maybe not 95, that's a high level, but are priority projects, they're must-to-dos. And now that's a lot of projects, but a lot of them are different in scope and scale, as I said. And with Grey County, one thing I did want to, from a staff perspective, we are looking at efficiencies across staff when we're looking at Grey Road 1921 roundabout, for example, not our project, but it is having an impact on our infrastructure, because now we have to move our booster station. And part of that is they are bringing money to do that and to contribute to that. And we also do look at, we compare our 5 and 10-year capital projects to make sure that we're sequencing and aligning them where needed. Because the last thing we want to do is have Grey Road 19 4-laned and we're tearing up Jozo's and Montero Road, et cetera. So we're trying to use the same projects to get similar work done, because we can realize efficiencies in mobilizing a same contractor and demobilizing a construction site. So a prime example of that is Price's development, where we're partnering on stormwater works and setting up, and the county is setting up the future 4-laning of Grey Road 19 in that area, so that the stormwater work's already done. So there's some economies of scale by partnering. I won't speak to the rest of it, but I know with our comparison of our 5-year capital plan, we are in frequent communication to make sure we're sequencing and our projects and making sure that we're finding efficiencies.
Okay. So one last question. We've for all our members, we've talked about Craigleith and some of the projects there. We've talked about Thornbury and Thornbury Village West. We've talked about Lower Bay and its west side storage and pumping. In the sense of Clarksburg, there was a major EA out there. Can you give some of our members in Clarksburg area where we're going with projects in their area?
Well, I'll kick off just in relation to that EA. I found that quite interesting. It was a year into council, and I believe J.L. Richards did the report as well for the Clarksburg EA. There was identification. Clarksburg is a unique animal. There's no identification for contaminated groundwater, septic agent performance. We looked at the downtown core and opportunities there, or lack thereof, because of the system. So then they came back with, what do we do there? There's a lot of, and one thing that I found surprisingly is the scope of some of the wells and septic systems falling below what would be standard, especially where they are, and then even with growth. So the executive summary on that report's available. That was done by J.O. Richards, and it's just, then there was opportunities on what to do. One is do nothing, which is not feasible. Two is to expand water and sewer into the downtown core. Three or four is to go through the entire area, very geographically spread out as well. So that has its own set of challenges as well. So everything's been identified through the EA. Every opportunities have been discussed with the EA, and then where it sits on Director Kerry's file, I'll digest to him right now. But the ingredients are there. It's just a matter of, I guess, taking it to the next level.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I know one of the things that that came out of that EA was, from a servicing extension standpoint and affordability, it was just way over the threshold of affordability. So that's not necessarily a barrier to implementing, though, because one of the things that we've been looking at, because this is, again, one of those things where we need to be kind of shovel ready. So we have this EA in hand. And if, one of the things we've been looking at for Clarksburg and is there some funding, external funding that we could bring to the table that would help offset that affordability issue? So that's one. The other thing that, so again, not shelving the document, but keeping it front facing so that if opportunities arise, we can put them into play. The second part I wanted to talk about when we're looking at long-term planning is we mentioned the West Side Water Storage Class EA. So when we were looking at setting up the kind of the fundamentals and principles of like what are we wanting to plan for in the long term with that project, and Clarksburg we included in there that someday we will be hooking up Clarksburg with water in particular and wastewater, and that we want to have the storage facility sized appropriately so that we can provide adequate water storage for protection of Clarksburg when they're hooked up to water. So just want to make it clear that we are connecting the dots on different projects and setting ourselves up so that we're not going backwards. So again, worst case scenario is, okay, now we've serviced Clarksburg, but we don't have adequate storage because we never thought of that when we did the West Side Storage Class EA project. So yeah, it's not shelved by any means, but we do need some funding opportunities to help offset that cost to residents for that local improvement. And I truly believe that we need to be shovel ready, because I think there's going to be some infrastructure funding coming, both provincially and federally, and we need to be able to act on it when it does.
Yeah, Brian, just fast numbers for you. I think there's just under 400 units, and the 20-year lifespan cost would have been over $70 million for those units. So the affordability index is out the window for number one. But you're talking about, I think that was fiscally was probably one of the major, not just the geographical spread out, because of how it impacts fiscally. So funding opportunities, absolutely, but asking the town and the residents to foot that bill at 2019 costs of around $75 million over under 400 locations is quite extensive.
Okay, well, I think the point of positioning these questions to you was to have our members have an assurance that you know what the issues are, that you got a path forward and you're handling them, you're not ignoring them, and to have 100 and some odd projects for our municipality is an enormous task, but at least we're starting to detail and put in priority those that are necessary, whether they be growth or just maintenance. So thank you to both of you. I'll pass it back to Jim.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Brian. Yeah. So I think on Clarksburg, like a lot of the major projects, and I guess I'll close with one last kind of question and suggestion, I guess. We've talked in the past about how we've had an implementation gap in terms of not being able to get the shovels in the ground And in fact, we had a period of time when depreciation was greater than the value of the new projects that were going in. It certainly seems as though, Sean, through your work with the support of council, you're, making great efforts to try to, advance the implementation, planning to execute, not planning to plan. So a question I would have would be in terms of, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, in terms of keeping town residents apprised of progress that's being made on key projects. Maybe we could just, talk for a couple of minutes in terms of what is being anticipated in that regard, because I think we do want to try and keep our finger on the pulse of how effectively the team is able to actually move forward and get some of this stuff happening.
Yeah, maybe I'll start. I think one of the things, Jim, that I've been wanting to do, and I think we'll see it shortly with our new website that's going to launch here shortly from the town. And we've put a lot of effort into trying for these project websites is to having specific information that's consistent, but also shows a bit of a dashboard as to where we are with big projects. And so, I've looked at municipalities like City of Guelph, for example, has a really interesting way in which they convey capital projects on a website. And yeah, you can get the detail if you want it, or you have a dashboard that says you're on budget or you're on time or whatever, right? Whatever the main points you want to get across are. And I think that's also helpful for residents, but also for council, because there's a lot going on there, and it's generally you don't come back to discussions unless it's either really good news or it's a bad news story, right? So I don't think that's fair to anybody. And so I'd rather have the information live on a website. And maybe my update to council will be, let's just go peruse through the website and we can ask questions on that. And it's, it's tiered based on scope and scale of the project. And you have 3 levels of tier with corresponding levels of information. But to me, I think it's how do you get the information across in a consistent way and an efficient way, so that it's not getting buried in quarterly staff reports to council, because that council ingests a lot of information at our committee of the whole, as Peter Borden or Councilor Borden know as well. So it's how can we easily access that information? So I think that's what is on my radar for our capital projects in particular, and making it front and center for the major big projects that those tier ones that have a significant funding allotment for them. So those are my thoughts.
And I think planning, not the planning department, planning on the operations side comes in to key. And I know Sean, came in. We'll talk about the Thornbury wastewater treatment plant. That it came in the middle of things where we started building a matchbook house, and we ended up needing a real building, and that when you plan properly, there's a waste of time and money there, and that's infuriating. That's where you have to come back and say, why wasn't this done right in the beginning when we're this far down the road? I think those things, and actually I shouldn't say I think, I know under Sean's direction, those things have been corrected, where everybody's engaged, and his matrix and his measurable matrix for the staff on projects is coming to fruition. So I don't think we're going to have those issues as we move forward. So that's key, because otherwise you could just have a project saying it's going to cost you $1. Oh no, it's $1.25. No, it's $1.50. It ends up at $3.25. You can't be more infuriating to the taxpayers, because it shows like you're not knowing what you're doing as well as you move forward. So that's something that the planning of the operations capital projects, and as Sean said, when we have when I look at all of them, 116 I think actively, and that's a lot to keep track of, especially fiscally, to Brian's point, when 85% of them are deemed necessary. Some are smaller in scope and some are grandiose in scope, but that's a lot of planning and a lot of money to filter out and to plan that we're going to have that. And then what's the soft and hard benefits of that? How much is it going to help now? How long is it going to last? And how is it going to help us with expansion in the future? Because the worst thing you could get into is saying, hey, we're here and we don't have enough to support that.
I think if I could just add one more thing to that, Jim, sorry, is, when we're looking at that return on investment and how much we can stretch out of an asset, right? Whether it's a piece of equipment or machinery or pump or whatever. I always go back to thinking about our operators who are involved in these projects as well, because we want them to be able to, operate and maintain them. They're the ones that are really pushing for that value out of those, right? Because they don't want to be in there fixing these things in the middle of the night. They want good value for the town and equipment that stands that kind of life cycle cost that we predicted it would. And that specifically goes back to the asset management plan, because we want to extend that condition of that asset as far as possible, so that we're not prematurely replacing it. So I always go to the operators to say, you guys are going to be the ones operating this stuff for the most part. What do you think? And you get a really open, honest response. And it's generally like, these are the options we should be looking at because we get longevity out of it and good value.
Yeah. And so I was just going to say in closing, I think it's obvious based on, the remarks, questions that we receive from members, that it's obvious to all of us the significant impact that infrastructure has on quality of life and the financial health of the town. And so I think, providing some form of tracking and therefore some degree of accountability in terms of success at actually executing and getting, the infrastructure that we need in place is something that we would be looking for on behalf of our members and working in conjunction with council and staff. So we'll continue to be plugged into the efforts as it relates to the infrastructure file in particular, with Brian's leadership on the infrastructure piece. So just wanted to say that we are keenly interested and very much appreciate both for Sean and Peter the fact you made the time available to join us. I know it's the second appearance for both of you this year at one of our events, and I say it's very much appreciated, because getting the chance to actually have direct conversations and pose questions to you, I think is very valuable for all of us.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jim and Brian and Crystal and the team for putting this together. It's just a way to get, unfortunately it's virtually and, standing up sometimes face-to-face asking questions, but people have gotten into a virtual world. So the back and forth works very well. As we move forward with operations and things like that, we have to be cognizant, and I've seen the comments as well, how climate change plays into that and the nice thing is staff, not just at operations at all levels, are factoring that into as we go ahead, with everything. So when something becomes when something that was more fringe becomes mainstream, it only helps. And I'm not saying by any stretch of imagination that climate change was fringe, but now it's upfront and focused as part of all discussions in all departments, and that's good to see, because there's things we can't control, and there's things we can control. So if you can plan as best you can, like Sean said, the night of that storm, they were planning as best they can, and then it still went up by 100%. But as long as we plan and we look forward thinking with that will help a lot. So thanks to you guys for putting this together, most definitely. And we're always available for for any input from the BMRA for sure.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks to you.
Thank
Have
you.
a good evening.
Good night.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks everybody. Thank you.
Bye.